Have you ever played a Pokemon game and been absolutely dumbfounded by what your opponent decided to do? Does the CP ever do things that seemingly make zero sense? Why is Drake bringing in his Salamence against my Ice type? Is he stupid? Well, like the ancient Greeks discovering science and learning that no, lightning is not the angry smitings of a sky-based sex pest, but is instead the process of, ions? Is it ions? I'm here to dispel the confusion around the logic behind Pokemon Switch AI with some good old-fashioned knowledge. Specifically, when a CP or computer player loses a Pokemon, how does the game determine which teammate to send out next? Now, you very well might not care about the logic behind this seemingly inane decision, and maybe you prefer to just keep sacrificing goats. Well then why did you click on the video? But if you do choose to take your head out of the sand, knowing a CP's switch logic means that you can always predict which of their Pokemon will come out next in any given situation, helping you better plan out battles and avoid some otherwise dangerous matchups, both of which are invaluable during challenge runs like Nuzlocke and or when you're playing advanced difficulty ROM hacks. For example, if your opponent has an Arena Trap Dug Trio, it may behoove you to know when he's coming out so that you don't accidentally get stuck in with an electric type. Or maybe your opponent has a Gyarados with Dragon Dance and you want to make sure he comes out against a Pokemon that can easily get the KO before the Cranky Pool Noodle can set up. Pokemon Switch logic changes across different generations, so we'll start with the OG games and go from there. Side note, unless a ROM hack specifically has custom designed logic, most of them will have identical Switch logic to their base generation. Anyways, you better hold on to your hats, folks, because the Gen 1 Switch AI is based on a web of complex interactions that I've only been able to fully understand after years of practice and patience. See, on any given turn of the battle, the CP starts by evaluating their team order, and that's it. If you know a trainer's inherent team order, you know the exact order that they'll send out their Pokemon no matter what. A bit disingenuous to call this Switch logic, but as we move to Gen 2, things immediately become more complex, albeit only slightly. In Gen 2, the opponent now uses the typing of the current player Pokemon to determine which of their teammates to send out. Each Pokemon on the CP's team is assigned a value of -1, 0, or +1 based on the following 3 steps. 1. Every CP Pokemon starts with a score of 0. 2. If the CP Pokemon has a move, including status moves, with a type advantage against the player Pokemon, they get +1. And 3. If the CP Pokemon takes super effective damage from either of the player Pokemon's types, they get -1. Logically, the Pokemon with the highest score gets sent out next, with tiebreakers going to team order. The only exception to this is that if all remaining Pokemon have a score of -1, then the Pokemon gets sent out in random order. Let's use Karen as an example. Say you just defeated her Umbreon with your Poliwrath. Congratulations, good job. Using our 3-step process, Karen's remaining Pokemon have the following scores. As a result, Vileplume will come out next, which makes natural sense given that she has a super effective Grass-type move against Poliwrath. But what if you knocked out Umbreon with Heracross? Not sure how, since Heracross basically doesn't learn any fighting-type moves in Gen 2, but maybe you pre-damaged for a reversal sweep, I don't know. Now, you might think that Houndoom would come out since she has a super effective flamethrower, but by following the Gen 2 Switch logic, we see that Houndoom has a score of 0, because the +1 from Step 2 is cancelled out by the -1 from Step 3. So instead, it'll again be Vileplume based on team order. One last example here. Let's say you've scaled Mount Silver and are locked into the battle of a lifetime against Trainer Red. Your Scizor has sliced through Pikachu like a perfectly cooked fish fillet, and now you're wondering which of Red's 4 remaining Pokemon comes out next. If you assume that it's all about super effective moves, you might expect it to be Charizard, but actually, it's Venusaur. Why? Well, because Venusaur knows Sunny Day, which in the Switch logic is considered a Fire-type move, resulting in a +1 score for both Venusaur and Charizard, with the tie again going to team order. Hopefully, the 3-step process of Gen 2's Switch logic is easy enough to follow, because Gen 3's... It's a mess, man. A big, confusing, stinky mess. But before we break it all down, I'm giving away Pokemon cards thanks to the sponsor of this video, via Whatnot. Whatnot is a live stream shopping platform where you can buy, sell, and auction pretty much anything. They hooked me up with $500 to buy all sorts of different Pokemon cards and packs that will all go to one of you. Using Whatnot was a ton of fun. Placing bids is seamless and exciting. Everything from the quality of the cards to taxes and shipping fees are fully transparent, and the sellers are always interacting with the viewers so that you can get a feel for who you're buying from. I pretty quickly found a favorite seller that I vibed with and ended up getting some really cool cards at a great price. So if you want to enter the giveaway, just leave your Whatnot username in the comment section down below and I'll pick a random lucky winner.
Wait, can I enter?
Do you have a Whatnot account?
No.
Well, that's fine, because you and anyone else who hasn't created a Whatnot account before should absolutely do so by using my link, because it'll get you $15 off your first purchase anywhere on the app. As always, please shop and bid responsibly, and if you have any questions, you can always reach out to individual sellers. Thanks so much to Whatnot for sponsoring this video. Now, let's get back to talking about Gen 3 Switch logic. Distilled to its simplest form, Gen 3 Switch logic has two phases. 1. Check if any Pokemon has a super effective move against the current player Pokemon. If so, send it out. And 2. If no Pokemon has a super effective move against the current player Pokemon, look for a Pokemon with a move of the same type as the recently fainted Pokemon. Yeah, let's focus on the first phase, which is the most important and actually has several sub-phases. And speaking of subs, if you enjoy this type of educational content, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Sorry, but seriously, let me know if you want more of this stuff. These games are so rich and there is so much that we can cover if you all are interested. Anyways, if an enemy only has one Pokemon with a super effective move, things are easy because that Pokemon will be sent out next. And unlike in Gen 2, status moves do not count as being super effective. Hey, Future Flygon here. So I actually need to make a quick correction based on information that I found out after writing this script. Turns out that while status moves do not count as being super effective for this initial check for super effective moves in Phase 1, there's a second check at the start of Phase 2 where they do count. So functionally, the AI will first prioritize super effective damaging moves, then move on to super effective status moves, and finally finish with the Phase 2 calculation that I explain later in the video. I know that this is really confusing, but short of rewriting this entire section of the script, this is the best I can do. In the summary graphics, I'll make sure to clarify this mini step that happens at the start of Phase 2 so that you don't ever forget. Cool? Alright, sweet. Now if there are 2 or more Pokemon with a super effective move, here's where things get more complicated. In these instances, the CP will send in the Pokemon with the worst type matchup against the current player Pokemon, which is very counterintuitive, as is the way that the type matchups are actually calculated, so buckle up. First, every Pokemon begins with a score of 10. Then, for each potential switch-in, the game looks at the individual type matchups between the player Pokemon's 2 types and the CP Pokemon's 2 types, resulting in 4 distinct type matchups. An immunity multiplies the base score by 0, a resistance halves it, rounded down, and super effective damage doubles it. If a player Pokemon only has a single type, it's considered to have a second identical type for these calculations, still resulting in 4 type matchups. However, if a CP Pokemon only has a single type, then there will only be 2 type matchups to consider. After this arithmetic is done for every Pokemon with a super effective attack, the Pokemon with the highest score is sent out, with ties again being resolved by team order. Rest assured, this sounds a little more complicated than it actually is. Let's use the Emerald fight against Steven Stone as an example. In this hypothetical, you use Starmie to take out his lead Skarmory with a Thunderbolt, and Steven now sees that 3 of his Pokemon have super effective moves against the Speedy Sea Star. So let's calculate the scores for each. Against Aggron, we have Water vs Steel, Water vs Rock, Psychic vs Rock, and Psychic vs Steel for a total score of 10. Against Cradily, we have Water vs Grass, Water vs Rock, Psychic vs Grass, and Psychic vs Rock, once again for a total score of 10. And finally, against Metagross, we have Water vs Psychic, Water vs Steel, Psychic vs Psychic, and Psychic vs Steel for a total score of just 2. So we see that Aggron and Cradily both have the highest score of 10, and since Aggron is first in the team order, he'll be the first Pokemon to switch in, which happens to be pretty sweet in this instance since Starmie can now chain a second kill with a Surf. Now, there are 2 teeny tiny itty bitty baby caveats that I have to mention here, and unfortunately they do make things a little more complicated. In the above examples, changing the order of how the 4 type matchups are evaluated doesn't ultimately change any of the total scores, but because of the rounding errors that occur from dividing odd numbers by 2, this isn't actually always the case. For example, consider the type matchups between Blaziken and Lunatone. If you do the calculations in this order, you get a score of 4, but if you switch the order of the last 2 calcs, you get a score of 5. So which is it? 4 or 5? Well, it turns out that the game has a built-in order in which it evaluates type matchups that, as far as I can tell, has no real logic behind it. So in the case of the Blaziken vs Lunatone matchup, because of this internal order and the rounding errors, Lunatone gets a score of 4 instead of 5. In the baseline games, this will rarely come up, if ever, but it absolutely does in games like Emerald Kaizo. A ROM hack that's insane difficulty level is directly responsible for people discovering all this information in the first place. The second teeny tiny itty bitty baby caveat is that if a CP Pokemon gets a score of 0, it will never be sent out next, even if it has a super effective move. This can happen as a result of an immunity, like when evaluating Lantern against Steven's Claydol, or in instances where a dual type CP Pokemon resists all of the player Pokemon's types, like when evaluating Ninetales against Drake's Kingdra. In these instances, or when there's no longer any super effective moves left, we move on to Phase 2. This one is weirder, but significantly less complicated, at least in practice. Basically, in Step 2, the CP is looking for a Pokemon with a move of the same type as the Pokemon that just fainted, and for this step, status moves actually do count. If there are no Pokemon where that's true, or if the player Pokemon resists the move of the same type, then the CP will just send out their Pokemon in team order. The actual coding for this phase is more complex, but that's more or less how it shakes out. And if this is all too complicated, that's okay, because it basically never comes up in the vanilla Gen 3 games, and you can just assume that things come out in team order after evaluating Phase 1. But as an example, we can look again at the fight against Steven Stone. Let's say that instead of killing Skarmory with Starmie, you've instead opted to take the KO with your reliable Mightyena. Not sure how you do that, but let's just say you did. None of Steven's Pokemon have a super effective move into the Dark type, so instead, the CP looks for a Pokemon with a Flying or Steel type move to match Skarmory's 2 types. Since Armaldo has Aerial Ace, he'll come out next. And then if you take him out, Claydol will be third, matching Ancient Power to Armaldo's Rock type. Then it'll be Aggron, matching Claydol's Ground type with Earthquake, followed by Cradily with Ancient Power, and finally, by default, Metagross. So now you've got pretty much everything you need to understand Gen 3 Switch logic. Is your brain hurting yet? Are you completely lost? Hopefully the answers to those questions are no and yes respectively, because it's time for Gen 4 Switch logic, which is not at all any easier. In fact, if anything, it's even more complicated, but fortunately, it shares many similarities to the Gen 3 Switch logic, so we're not really starting from zero. Once again, Gen 4 Switch logic has 2 phases. The first phase is looking for super effective moves, and the second phase is looking for the highest damaging move. Does that sound at least a little familiar? You still buckled up? Maybe you want to put a helmet on too? As I said, in Gen 4's Phase 1, the CP is again looking for a Pokemon with a super effective move. Only this time, it does consider status moves, and it prioritizes Pokemon with the best type matchups, not the worst. There you go, definitive proof that Gen 4 is harder than Gen 3. Sinnoh stay winning. The exact calculus for evaluating the type matchups is also quite different. Here, every Pokemon starts with a score of 0. The CP then individually looks at the 2 types of each of its Pokemon and evaluates them against the combined typing of the player's current Pokemon. If one of the CP Pokemon's types has a quad effective matchup, that Pokemon gets +4 added to its score. If there's a single effective matchup, it gets +2. A neutral matchup grants +1, resisted grants 0.5, quad resisted grants 0.25, and an immunity grants a big fat goose egg. With 2 types, that means that there is a maximum score of +8 and a minimum score of 0. And like in Generation 3, if a Pokemon only has a single type, that type is counted twice in these calculations, though unlike in Gen 3, this is true for both the player and the CP's Pokemon. Naturally, again, the Pokemon with the highest score, with ties going to team order, will be the one that comes in next, though there is, of course, a caveat. A bug in the Gen 4 code means that the maximum score of +8, resulting from 2 quad effective matchups, actually results in an effective score of 1.75, sitting squarely between a double neutral matchup, or a super effective plus immune matchup, and a resisted plus neutral matchup. You gotta love bugs. To get a hang of these calculations, we can consider a few arbitrary matchups between a player's Rhyperior and a CP's team of 16 Pokemon, I guess. Of these 16, the Pokemon that would come out first is Swampert, since water is quad effective and ground is super effective for a total score of +6. Next would be Starmie, then Kabutops, Tentacruel, Dugtrio, Gallade, Infernape, Nidoqueen, Sableye, Vaporeon due to the bug, Butterfree, Gengar, Charizard, Crobat, Zapdos, and finally Raichu. As a more practical example though, let's calculate the scores from Cynthia's team against a player's Lucario. Here there are 3 Pokemon with super effective moves: Togekiss, Lucario, and Garchomp. So with the matchups evaluated, the order of Pokemon sent out would be Cynthia's own Lucario, followed by Garchomp, and then Togekiss. After that though, assuming that Lucario manages to sweep all 3 of his foes, in order to determine which of Cynthia's final 2 Pokemon will come out, we need to move on to Phase 2. In Phase 2, the CP will calculate how much damage the moves from each remaining Pokemon will do if they were used by the recently fainted Pokemon, and send out the teammate that corresponds to the highest damaging move. Confusing, I know, but it should become clear with a few examples. Lucario just knocked out Togekiss, and Cynthia now needs to determine whether to send out Roserade or Milotic. So with her supercomputer brain, Cynthia calculates how much damage Togekiss will do to Lucario with every single one of Roserade and Milotic's attacks. Since Surf would do the most damage, Milotic comes out next. In this instance, we probably didn't even really need to do any actual calculations to figure this out. Every possible move choice is a special move, and when you factor in the base power of every move along with the type matchups, it's very clear that Surf is the best choice just by looking at the movesets. And though the answer will often be obvious, it's not always that clear-cut. Phase 2 calculations factor in the stab of the fainted Pokemon, and they also factor in differences between not just the attacker's physical and special attack stats, but also the defender's physical and special defense stats as well. As a more complicated example, we can think about a weird scenario where against Lucian, we've defeated his lead Mr. Mime, his Ace Gallade, and his speedy Alakazam, all with our bulky Blissey, I guess. So now neither Espeon nor Bronzong see super effective hits, meaning that we've moved on to Phase 2. So the question that we need to ask is, which move does Alakazam do the most damage to Blissey with? Now Alakazam is an extremely strong special attacker and gets stabbed with Psychic, so one might think that the answer is Espeon since he's first in team order. But Blissey also has such piss poor physical defense that maybe the answer is Bronzong with Earthquake. As you can see, it's not immediately clear, and the result will actually depend on Blissey's individual stats and how she's trained. Plus, there is one more wrinkle that affects things a not so insignificant amount. Because if the CP sees a kill with 2 or more moves from 2 different Pokemon, then that will result in a tie, and the Pokemon that's first in team order will come out, regardless of which move actually does the absolute most damage. Do note though that these calculations are always done as if the player Pokemon is at full HP, and it's not based off of the Pokemon's current HP. So let's do one last example here, once again using Blissey. Blissey, but this time evaluating Flint's team. Houndoom and Infernape are dead in this scenario, and Blissey has just mounted a phenomenal victory against Magmortar, leaving Flareon and Rapidash left. Since we're in Phase 2, we see that the most damage is when Magmortar uses Rapidash's Flare Blitz, but because Blissey also dies to Flareon's Giga Impact, it's actually the pup that comes out first due to team order. However, if Blissey was at a high enough level where Magmortar doesn't see the kill with either Flare Blitz or Giga Impact, Flint would then just revert to prioritizing the highest damaging move, and as a result, it'd be Rapidash who comes out first. Okay, let's take a deep breath. We're officially done with Gen 4 Switch AI. It definitely takes some time to get the hang of it, but with a bit of patience, you'll develop an intuition that'll get you through most situations without even needing to make any hard calculations. Now, you might be a little concerned that in roughly 20 minutes, we've only gone through the Switch logic for 4 of Pokemon's 9 generations, and it's gotten increasingly more complicated each time. But I've got great news for you. Not only does the Switch logic in Gen 5 stay exactly the same for every subsequent generation, it's also significantly simpler than Gen 4, Gen 3, and arguably even Gen 2. See, in Gen 5, Game Freak decided to completely toss out all that complicated crap and reduced Switch logic to answering one simple question. Which Pokemon has the highest base power move when factoring in type matchups? All the multi-step calculations and phases are gone. The only thing to do is look at the base power of every move on the enemy team, multiply them based on the type effectiveness into the current player Pokemon, and then pick the Pokemon with that strongest move. To make things even simpler, we can completely ignore status moves, and we don't even factor in stab. As a brief example, let's look at Iris from Black 2 White 2 Challenge Mode. Say Darmanitan takes out her lead Hydreigon. Who comes in next? Well, here's the base power of every possible move she could use, and here's how they look after factoring in type effectiveness against Darmanitan's fire type. So, as we can clearly see, Aggron with 300 base power Head Smash will come in first, followed by Lapra with 220 base power Hydro Pump, Archeops with 200 base power Stone Edge thanks to winning the tie via team order, Haxorus with 200 base power Earthquake, and finally Druddigon with a measly 120 base power Outrage. That is so much easier, right? The only thing that ever so slightly complicates things is moves with variable power that all fall into one of a few categories. First, moves like Acrobatics, Payback, and Avalanche can double their power with certain conditions, but for Switch logic purposes, they will only ever have their low base power. So if, for example, you killed Iris's Hydreigon with a Sock, Archeops' Acrobatics would still only be 55 times 2 for 110 base power, which is less than the 120 base power moves on all 4 of Iris's other Pokemon, meaning that Archeops would actually be last to come out despite having a super effective move. Another example is multi-hit attacks like Rock Blast, Bullet Seed, and Double Kick, which for Switch logic purposes only have the base power of one single hit, meaning that they are almost never going to be the highest base power move. This is most prominent in the Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon fights against Kahili, who has a Mandibuzz with Bone Rush, as well as a Toucannon with Rock Blast and Bullet Seed. Even though these moves can have a maximum power of 125, and in the case of Toucannon, they're guaranteed to have that much thanks to Skill Link, if you happen to take out Kahili's Braviary with a Lantern, for example, she'll still just send out Hawlucha, who sees higher base power with neutral Throat Chop and Poison Jab than super effective Bone Rush and Bullet Seed. Another caveat is moves like Grass Knot, Low Kick, and Gyro Ball that also have variable power, but when evaluating them for Switch logic, the CP assumes a flat power of 60, regardless of how much damage they might actually do. And finally, moves like Seismic Toss, Nightshade, and Psywave are all assumed to have one base power, meaning that they will quite literally never be the highest base power move, unless the CP also has a Ditto or something. The very last caveat, I promise this is the last thing, is that in Generation 6, 8, and 9, any trainer that has a Pokemon that can Mega Evolve, Dynamax, or Terrastalize will always come out last and should be completely ignored when determining Switch order. With that though, you've now got absolutely everything you need to predict which of your enemy's Pokemon will come out next in every single generation. If you have additional questions or want to learn more about the intricacies of Switch logic, I've included a bunch of links that I found helpful when writing this script. But one of the reasons I made this video in the first place is that a lot of in-depth Pokemon knowledge is not very well documented and even less accessible, so maybe this video will be helpful to someone. And if not, I hope that it was at the very least mildly entertaining. That's the standard I strive for here. If you enjoyed watching, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Or don't, I don't know. Either way, stay tuned for more Nuzlocke content, and until then, remember to always, always, always play around the critical hit.